The tech boom of the 90s and 2000s has brought us some of the richest, most influential people in the world. Love them or hate them, these billionaire moguls have a huge impact on our society, government, and everyday life. Yet they pale in comparison to John D. Rockefeller. In the early 1900s, he alone controlled nearly 90% of the American oil industry, which, at the time, was one of the most important facets of the US economy. But he didn't just sell oil. He dictated prices, controlled transportation, and, behind closed doors, quietly influenced the very system that was supposed to keep him in check. As a result, thousands of businesses rose or collapsed based solely on his decisions. To some, he was a genius, the greatest businessman to ever live. To others, he was the architect of the most ruthless monopoly in American history. This is the story of how Rockefeller used leverage, pressure, and his unimaginable wealth to outmaneuver his competition, outmatch the journalists who tried to expose him, and ultimately defeat the politicians who tried to stop him. Rockefeller's story is often told as a classic rags to riches tale. A disciplined young man rises from poverty, works harder than everyone else, and builds one of the greatest fortunes in history. But that version leaves out the most important parts. Rockefeller wasn't just a man who knew how to make money. He quite literally invented the concept of corporate power. Some might even go so far as to say that he invented the idea of the modern corporation. Before Rockefeller, industries were messy. Both in the United States and abroad, the average sector might consist of dozens or sometimes hundreds of small players competing for survival. Each operated independently, which meant that each one was vulnerable to collapse should something unexpected happen. It was less free market and more free chaos. And as you'll see, Al Rockefeller was not the type of person to abide chaos. He recognized that industries could not only be consolidated, but engineered. In doing so, he forced the United States to confront a question it had never faced before. What happens when one man becomes more powerful than the system meant to regulate him? But that conversation will come in due time. Like any good story, this one needs to start at the beginning. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York. His early life was something his older self would have abhorred. Unstable, disordered, and constantly shifting between scarcity and sudden abundance. At the center of that volatility was his father, a man known as Devil Bill. It was a hard-won nickname that reflected a reputation built over years of deception, opportunism, and a kind of theatrical dishonesty that people both feared and remembered. That is to say, Bill Rockefeller was not a traditional provider. He was a drifter, a salesman, and to many, a con artist. He had all the brilliance of P.T. Barnum, except that his morals were even looser. Devil Bill would often disappear for weeks, sometimes months at a time, leaving the family with nothing. During those times, John's mother would have to scrounge in order to keep the family fed. Then, out of nowhere, Bill would return, loaded with money, gifts, and stories. For John, the constant shifting between poverty and luxury was formative. Over time, he came to see money not just as something you earned, but something that determined whether your life was stable or chaotic. Control, he realized, came from consistency. And consistency came from discipline. That lesson was reinforced by his mother, Eliza. A deeply religious woman, she approached life in the exact opposite way his father did. Where Bill was reckless, she was methodical. Where he gambled, she saved. She taught her young son to account for every dollar, waste nothing, and to live with as much structure and purpose as possible. This contradictory parental influence led John to develop a powerful desire for wealth and an equally strong desire for control over it. By the time he was a boy, he was already running small, calculated ventures, everything from raising turkeys to selling produce to lending other children money, with interest, of course. While other children were playing, he was tracking his earnings in a notebook, accounting for every dollar, just as his mother had instructed. Along the way, he learned hundreds of little lessons about how people, money, and systems worked. When he finally reached his teenage years, he was no longer chasing opportunity, but learning how to create it. At just 16 years old, John D. Rockefeller stepped into the workforce. It was not a grand entrance. Despite spending most of his youth as a street corner entrepreneur, the future visionary's first foray into employment was as a bookkeeper at a small Cleveland produce commission firm called Hewitt and Tuttle. Here, there were no big deals, no headlines, and no hints of the young man's future dominance. But what the experience gave Rockefeller was something far more valuable: access. His position gave him a front-row seat to how businesses actually operated. Rather than being forced to view them in terms of how they presented themselves to the public, stakeholders, and employees, he was able to see how they functioned beneath the surface. He used this access to study everything, from costs and margins to transportation fees and negotiations between suppliers and merchants. Through it all, he realized one very critical fact: prices are never fixed. Sure, they may look fixed, they may be presented as fixed, but the reality is that all pricing could be negotiated, adjusted, and optimized depending on timing, volume, and leverage. This realization changed everything, because if prices could be influenced, so too could the system around them. By his early 20s, Rockefeller had already moved beyond employment and into the world of business ownership. Leveraging his time at Hewitt and Tuttle, he entered the produce trading industry. For several years, he enjoyed the benefits of buying and selling in-demand goods across a rapidly growing economy. Then came the Civil War. Though one might assume this would be detrimental to his industry, the opposite actually occurred. As supplies became critical, demand surged overnight, boosting prices and multiplying Rockefeller's profits. For him, it was proof of concept. Markets were not stable, but reactive. If you could understand the forces driving them, you could position yourself ahead of everyone else. But if he were really going to take advantage of this revelation, he would need a different industry. Trading goods didn't have the scalability he needed. There were simply too many external factors, too much unpredictability. And that's when Rockefeller found oil. It wasn't exactly a match made in heaven, at least not at first. In the late 1800s, the oil industry had all the features he abhorred. For starters, it was extremely chaotic, punctuated by wild price swings and inconsistent supply. Men were making fortunes, sure, but they were losing them just as often. The big difference was that where most people saw risk, Rockefeller saw inefficiency. More specifically, he saw inefficiency that he could leverage. Instead of drilling for oil like everyone else, Rockefeller made a decision that would define his entire career. He stepped away from the resource and focused on the process: refining. The way he saw it, drilling was the part of the industry that carried all the unpredictability. Refining sat at the center of the system. Without it, the industry couldn't produce anything usable. So, whoever controlled that point controlled the flow. Today, this is recognized as Rockefeller's first true system, as well as a formative tenet of modern business. Don't chase opportunity. Instead, position yourself at the point where everyone else's opportunities pass through. By 1870, Rockefeller was ready to scale his system. That's when he founded Standard Oil Company. Initially, it seemed like just another business jumping into a growing industry, but its true goal was to reshape the market itself in a way that would all but ensure Rockefeller got a taste of every dime spent. There were a few dozen refiners across the United States, and competition was fierce. Each operated independently, chasing unstable supply and undercutting one another in a race to survive. At the time, the average businessman's approach would be 100% grit and bootstraps: compete harder, lower price, and outwork your rivals. But Rockefeller had already moved past that way of thinking. To him, competition meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant chaos. So, instead of trying to win within the system, he began designing a way to control it. That was Standard Oil's strategy from the very beginning. While everyone else was trying to expand, Rockefeller wanted to consolidate. This shows up immediately in his approach to competitors. Rather than treat them like rivals, he approached them as future assets. And when they inevitably complained to him about the unpredictability of the market and how it was hurting their margins, Rockefeller made them an offer they couldn't refuse: join Standard Oil and gain stability, or go it alone and collapse. It's important to realize that this wasn't delivered as a threat. These types of offers might have helped inspire The Godfather, but Rockefeller was less a bully than a quiet strategist. He simply knew how to make resistance feel irrational. Over the years, he had mastered the oil business down to its smallest inefficiencies, including transport costs, refining yields, and market volatility. By the late 1860s, Standard Oil had advantages that others couldn't replicate. His pitch basically boiled down to, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. And people did. To understand why Standard Oil had so much sway, you have to understand a critical business concept: leverage. Publicly, Rockefeller's company appeared to be refining oil. Privately, he was refining everything about how his industry ran. This was all based on one single, overarching principle. The oil business isn't about producing oil. It's about moving it. Oil sitting in the ground has potential, but no leverage. The moment it enters a pipeline, a rail car, or a distribution network, it becomes dependent on systems. If those systems can be shaped, and Rockefeller knew how to do it, he understood that whoever controlled the flow had the ultimate control over the market. The drillers could produce all the oil they wanted. It did the market zero good if it were sitting in some warehouse in Texarkana. It needed to be transported from wells to refineries, from refineries to cities, and from cities to markets. At those points that Rockefeller planted Standard's flag. With control over oil movement, bottlenecks could be created, costs could be squeezed, and access could be granted or denied at will. This meant that Rockefeller's competitors weren't just competing on quality, but on whether they could even reach the market at all. Once the firm's control over transportation, distribution, and pricing began to align, Standard Oil stopped behaving like a company and began to behave like a network of fences within the industry. Essentially, these were barriers that he could throw in front of the competition to make their firms unsustainable. The unpredictability he used to encourage his competitors to join him still existed. He was now the architect of it. One of his most powerful tools for manufacturing this unpredictability was the railroads. At the time, these were the arteries of the industrial economy. And through a series of quiet, backroom negotiations, Standard Oil secured preferential rates from major railroad companies. Suddenly, he could transport oil more cheaply than anyone else, and that single advantage changed everything. With his reduced overhead, Rockefeller began lowering prices to apply pressure to the competition. If they reduced their own prices to compete with him, it meant they would be operating at a loss. If they refused, they lost customers. Either way, they got weaker. And once they weakened enough, Rockefeller moved in to offer them a way out, as join or die. Then came the rebate structures. These further solidified Standard's relationship with the train lines to the point that Rockefeller actually got paid when his competitors shipped their oil. Without their knowing it, they were actually funding the very company that would replace them. Year after year, more companies were absorbed into the Standard Oil fold, and by the late 19th century, Rockefeller controlled nearly 90% of oil refining in the United States. For the first time in history, an entire industry had been consolidated into a single system. And critics would later call it the octopus, a business that behaved more like a living thing than a financial entity. As the 1800s drew to a close, its tentacles were tightening their grip and threatening to establish a complete monopoly. The only question left was who, if anyone, could stop it. By the time Standard Oil reached its peak, Rockefeller had already done what no one else had ever thought possible. Rather than compete within a system, he had found a way to control it entirely. But control, to Rockefeller, was never the end goal, as even total domination entailed dependence and risk. One critical piece of the system remained outside its reach: the railroads. Though he'd certainly bent them to his advantage with the discounted shipping rates and rebates, they were nonetheless variables. What if they raised prices? What if they shifted terms, or even worse, decided to shift their loyalties? And so, Rockefeller began building pipelines. Not only were they a more efficient way to move oil from one place to another, but they also let him completely abandon his reliance on railroads. After all, pipelines were cheaper, faster, and most importantly, fully controlled by Standard Oil. For the first time, Rockefeller wasn't just influencing the system, but stepping out of it. The railroad company owners saw what was happening immediately, but rather than just sit back and let their most valuable customer become their biggest threat, they did something unexpected. they fought back. Some attempted to integrate forward, building their own refineries in an effort to reclaim leverage. Others slashed prices, restructured contracts, and tried to pull alienated businesses back into their networks. It might have worked in a normal marketplace, but by this point, the oil industry had evolved into something else. Thanks to his years of consolidation, Rockefeller had the leverage he needed to respond with as much pressure as he wanted. As soon as the railroads started to rebel, he forced prices down across the entire transportation network, rerouting shipments and affecting supply and demand across whole regions. With the market destabilized, railroad revenues began to fall. As their margins tightened, the companies had no choice but to cut wages and, in many cases, lay off workers. In some areas, the tensions boiled over into strikes and unrest, but the average railroad employee had no idea that their bosses were at the mercy of Standard Oil. And Rockefeller was waging a war that the average salaried employee couldn't even see, and it was crushing thousands of people in its wake. Standard's system had grown so large that it now had the power to decimate the American economy. Other industrialists like steel magnate Andrew Carnegie were not impressed. They had spent their entire lives building businesses that could thrive within an existing system. Rockefeller was proving he could tear that system down at will. For years, Rockefeller operated his web of power and profit in relative silence. He avoided publicity, rarely gave interviews, and kept his industry-changing methods largely hidden. Most Americans knew that Standard Oil was powerful, but to them, it was just another large company, no different than U.S. Steel or American Tobacco. It wasn't just Rockefeller's penchant for secrecy that helped ensure this. It was also the massive scale on which he was operating. By the turn of the 20th century, he wasn't just wealthy. He boasted a personal fortune that accounted for a measurable percentage of the entire American economy. So, when he made decisions, entire markets adjusted around them. But unlike other powerful men before and after, Rockefeller never felt compelled towards the spotlight. He didn't want to be famous or renowned. Instead, he preferred ambiguity. In his mind, power was far easier to maintain when people couldn't see how it worked. It was a winning strategy. But it all changed with one person, Ida Tarbell. Tarbell was a journalist, and an impeccable one at that. She also had a personal connection to the oil industry. Her father had been an independent refiner, one of many who had been pushed out during Standard Oil's rise. This had given her a first-hand look at how Rockefeller's system affected people who had no way of competing with it. Hoping to expose the magnate's strategies, Tarbell spent years researching Standard Oil, digging through records, interviewing sources, and reconstructing events piece by piece. Rather than uncover a single scandal, she found a pattern of operations that, when viewed together, finally exposed the invisible levers Rockefeller had been pulling for years. Deleted publications provided insight into the secret railroad deals, pricing strategies, and mechanisms of pressure applied to competitors behind closed doors. But the evidence itself was not enough. Like any good journalist, her true skill lay in translating what was happening into language that the public could understand. The result of her work was a 19-part investigative series from McClure's magazine, which ran from 1902 to 1904. Her work turned Rockefeller from an ambiguous representation of wealth into the face of unchecked corporate power overnight. And as more newspapers picked up the story, public interest surged, and from Main Street to Capitol Hill, conversations started to shift. What made the situation more striking was Rockefeller's response, or rather, his lack of one. He issued no public defense or rebuttal, nor did he make any effort to reshape the narrative. Whether this was strategic or a reaction to the growing chaos facing him, we'll never know. But we do know that it didn't work. Politics runs downhill of public sentiment, and as the latter began to shift, representatives and senators across the country began to recognize that the Standard Oil debacle had developed into a national issue. They were suddenly faced with questions from their constituents about whether the American economy still functioned as a free market or had been overtaken by powerful men with money. And at the center of the political response was President Theodore Roosevelt. Aside from his position at the top of the executive branch, Roosevelt was unique because he understood that the Standard Oil issue wasn't just about regulating a company. He and his administration were being tasked with confronting a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on elections, public approval, or even visibility. In 1906, the government launched an antitrust case unlike anything seen before. Evidence was gathered from across the country, including documents, testimonies, and transaction records, many of which Tarbell had collected during her investigation. These quickly came to reveal the strategy behind Rockefeller's system and the moves that had shaped multiple industries for decades. As the news began to disseminate down the chain, business owners and average workers alike were shocked by how deeply Standard Oil's tentacles reached into transportation, pricing, supply chains, and politics. It suddenly became clear that entire industries had been reshaped around Standard Oil's advantage, and that thousands of lives had been destroyed in the process. How many independent refiners had disappeared solely because they had been cut off from the systems they needed to survive? How many railroads had been bent into uneven agreements that distorted pricing across the entire country? Markets that were supposed to function through competition had, in many cases, been quietly decided in advance. The state argued that it was market manipulation, while Standard's lawyers argued it was all just business as usual. Finally, after years of legal battles, the case reached its conclusion. In 1911, the Supreme Court officially decided that Standard Oil had violated antitrust laws. As a punishment, Rockefeller's life's work would be broken apart into 34 separate companies. Its centralized control, meanwhile, would be dismantled completely. On the surface, it looked like a turning point, proof that even the most powerful corporation in the country could actually be held accountable. But beneath that decision, something more complex was already unfolding. America would soon learn that the system Rockefeller built was far more resilient than anyone expected. When the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil, it was supposed to be the end of a monopoly, of Rockefeller's control, and of an era in which a single company could dominate an entire industry. And for a moment, it looked as if that was exactly what would happen. Following the company's dissolution into 34 separate businesses, it appeared as if the system had corrected itself. It would only be a matter of time before competition returned, markets rebalanced, and power was redistributed. But what happened didn't follow that script, not even close. Instead, it soon became evident that Rockefeller's position had actually improved. A lot of this had to do with timing and technology. In the early 1910s, the demand for oil was rising rapidly due to industrial growth, urbanization, and most importantly, gasoline. Once considered a useless byproduct, gas was now becoming essential to the developing world, particularly thanks to the growing popularity of the automobile. Suddenly, the market that Standard Oil had once dominated was far larger than it had ever been. This left plenty of room for all 34 of the new companies to grow. And because Rockefeller still held ownership across them, that growth became his growth. By 1913, just 2 years after the ruling meant to break him, Rockefeller had become the world's first billionaire. Again, this accomplishment did not occur despite the breakup, but because of it. Somehow, he had managed to build a system so complete that it could actually absorb its own destruction and come back more powerful as a result. The monopoly was long gone, but its logic remained. Rockefeller had won. By the time John D. Rockefeller stepped away from the world of business, he had already achieved unimaginable wealth, unmatched influence, and the construction of a business so big that it had reshaped the entire country. With a mind like his and infinite funds at his disposal, he could have done virtually anything. Lucky for the world, the quiet, unassuming man from Richford, New York, chose to embrace philanthropy. And just as he'd done with Standard Oil, he approached this new endeavor systemically. Over the course of his later life, Rockefeller began directing vast portions of his fortune into institutions focused on education, medicine, and public health. He funded universities, built research institutions, and launched medical initiatives on a scale never seen before. His creation, the Rockefeller Foundation, became one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in history, contributing to healthcare advancements, disease eradication efforts, and the expansion of education across multiple regions. It was a turn nobody could have expected. a ruthless industrialist becoming a global benefactor, foregoing monopoly and control in favor of progress and impact. It seemed that, in the end, Rockefeller had decided that this great wealth came with great responsibility. In that way, his philanthropy wasn't about redemption, but fulfillment. Somewhere inside, he was still that poor kid who'd grown up suffering from the chaos of never knowing whether his next week would be spent in feast or famine. And while he spent plenty of his money on himself and his family, he eventually concluded that it was better to share it with everyone. That fact has complicated his legacy to the point that, nearly 100 years after his death, nobody can say for certain whether he deserves to be called a hero or a villain. One thing that is certain about John D. Rockefeller is that he left behind a lot more than just wealth. Perhaps his biggest contribution was a blueprint for thinking about business that has changed the game for hundreds of industries. When people talk about vertical integration, market consolidation, and controlling infrastructure, rather than just the product, they're using modern terms to discuss things Rockefeller all but invented. Rather than focusing on beating the competition, Rockefeller found a way to change the conditions of the game. Today, you can see echoes of this strategy every time a company moves beyond just selling products to directing the platforms those products rely on, or in industries where access, visibility, and distribution are no longer neutral, but shaped by the few who control the infrastructure behind them. The names have changed, the industries are different, and the technology is more advanced, but the logic is familiar. That was Rockefeller's real legacy. It wasn't oil. It wasn't even wealth. It was the realization that power, at its highest level, doesn't come from winning the game, thus but from deciding how it's played.